more classes after this. The next two classes I want to reserve for the discussion of the normative and social theoretical assumptions of this programmatic argument that I've been developing and discussing. In the next class, the general outline of the kind of social theory presupposed by this programmatic argument. After all, one of the justifications for pursuing a programmatic argument like the one I've developed here in an academic setting is that it forces us to clarify our ideas about society and its transformation. Every insight into reality presupposes a view of its transformation, and every view of possible transformation is the front line of a whole conception of the phenomenon. In this case, the phenomenon is society itself. In the next to the last class, the focus will be on the normative presuppositions of the argument, the view of humanity and its development that the argument presupposes, the normative foundations of these programmatic proposals. The last class I want to reserve entirely to discussion. So I would like each of you to come with ideas and objections, and they may well be ideas that you're writing up in your papers, but we should share them and discuss them here together. Today the theme is globalization, and the broad approach that I propose is that there isn't a globalization, yes or no, but there are alternative globalizations. So just as the response to the ideological argument about the market is not more market or less market, but which market, so too with respect to globalization, it's the same general idea. To replace the discussion of more or less globalization by the debate about which globalization, and therefore, as part of that, to characterize the specific form of globalization which is now being developed in the world, to criticize it, and to suggest the broad outlines of an alternative. Now let me begin with a remark amplifying what I said in an earlier class about the nation and nationalism. Humanity is divided into sovereign states. The peoples of the world are divided under the shield of armed states. The fundamental justification for this is that humanity can develop its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. And the shield provided by the armed states is the guarantee that these directions will be deep cutting, this difference of directions. That it won't just be folklore, cultural habits, but that will be translated into distinct institutions, and that the diversity of these institutions will be protected, if necessary, by armed force. And as I observed when I mentioned this theme before, for that difference, for that differentiation of humanity into peoples and states, we pay a tremendous price. The price is the danger of war. And the greatest evil threatening humanity remains what it has always been, which is war among the great powers. Now I want to develop that theme one step further by attempting to characterize what is specific about the nature of contemporary nationalism. The peoples of the world, or the collective identities that were the surrogate for nationalism. Nationalism is an ideology developed at the time of the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Used to have tangible collective identities embodied in their customs. To be a Roman, an ancient Roman, was to live according to the customs of the Romans. The collective identities had a tangible character translated into customs and into the differences among national customs. The specific character of contemporary nationalism is that this customary, tangible content of the collective identities is progressively eroded in the course of the worldwide practical and moral competition, emulation among the peoples of the world. Let me give you the example of the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the middle of the 19th century, because it is a characteristic, but at the same time, very revealing episode. The Japanese felt threatened by the possibility of invasion by the Western powers, and a faction of the Japanese elite then overthrew the imperial government and replaced it with the Tokugawa shogunate at the time of the Meiji Restoration. And they then proceeded to reform their country, to change its institutions in order to be able to defend themselves against the Western powers. They scoured the world to find which were the arrangements that they needed to import, to accept, and then to combine those imported arrangements and ideas with what would remain of their traditional collective identity. In other words, they had to bring to the altar of this worldwide competition, this military, economic, and ideological competition, a part of themselves. They had to tear out a part of themselves and sacrifice it so that the remainder could be defended. This is the example of the evisceration of the tangible collective identity. And this evisceration proceeds more and more, and it leads to what you could call a hollowing out of the tangible collective identities that sustain this idea of the differences among the peoples of the world. They become less different so that they can continue to be different. Now, therein lies, I want to argue, the characteristically poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side, and hate each other, not because they are different, but because they are becoming alike. And what results in this situation is an impotent rage to difference, a will to difference in the presence of the waning of actual difference. As the collective identity becomes less tangible, as it becomes a faith, a will, rather than a concrete set of arrangements, it also becomes less porous, less susceptible to compromise and to mixture, because it is the object of an intransigent faith. And in this faith, there is nothing that can be compromised. So you could say that the idea of the national differences, of the differences among the peoples of the world, is on a long trajectory. The starting point of the trajectory was the differences among the customary identities, the collective identities, and their customary expressions in the world. As in the example I gave of the idea of the Romans, that to be a Roman was to live according to the customs of the Romans. The point of arrival, the extreme opposite of this trajectory, is the transformation of the national differences into a form of moral specialization within mankind. In other words, the role of the different nations of the world is to instantiate, to exemplify different ways of being human, different experiments in civilization translated into particular institutional arrangements. Along the way in this passage from the customary tangible identities to the moral specialization, an accident occurs. And the accident is the evisceration of the customary collective identities that I mentioned a moment ago. So the differences among the peoples of the world become more dangerous or more poisonous in the course of this transformation from the tangible customary identities to the moral specialization. And that fact, if it is a fact, is part of the background to the problems of globalization that we now face. Now let me pause and ask whether you would like to comment on this idea. It's not self-explanatory. It may seem somewhat obscure to me, but I believe that it captures part of the specific reality of national differences in the world today. Any comment? Any remark? Yes.
I wonder if you could mention more what you mean by the differences, or like parse those out, because I could imagine a world where you're connected and you don't have to give up those differences. Maybe if you could articulate something like that.
Well, so the different peoples of the world have different habits, right? They have different ways of being, ways of acting. And those ways of acting could be just collective habits, or they could be crystallized in institutional arrangements. So for the Japanese to prevail, to be able to defend themselves at the time of the Meiji Restoration, they had to abandon some of their collective habits. They had to acquire Western industry, defense industry, for example. They had to build armed ships. They had to reorganize their army. They had to change some of their characteristic forms of hierarchy and replace them by command and control. So what I'm claiming is that some of those collective habits have to be abandoned, and that this abandonment then leads to the hollowing out of the inherited collective identity. The consequence is that in the short term, the nations of the world become more alike one another than they were before. They're not like isolated tribes in the Amazon. They have to emulate, they have to outcompete one another, not just with respect to production and warfare, but with respect to their culture. They have to expose themselves to the competitive pressure of other cultures and other nations. That leads to a certain convergence, and the convergence implies a partial hollowing out of the collective identity. That's the basic claim that's being made. So, in that situation, to go back to the example of the ancient Romans become more like the Carthaginians than they were before. If that process continues through reiterated emulation, competition, subjection to foreign influence, eventually the collective identity is hollowed out to such a point that it no longer remains the porous living body of custom there was. And then the actual difference begins to be replaced by the will to difference, which I call the object, then this intransigent faith in national difference. Now, the less tangible the national difference is, the less porous, the less susceptible to influence, the less susceptible to compromise it becomes. And that's what I'm arguing is the distinctive character of contemporary nationalism. The peoples of the world want to be different. And the waning of actual difference, rather than weakening the desire for difference, arouses it. So the desire for difference is aroused, is inflamed under the influence of the waning of actual difference. That's the basic argument. In order to understand why this passion for national difference is so strong, but at the same time so poisonous, as it can become a motive for war. Now, the nationalism that arose at the time of the French Revolution and that developed in the course of modern history was intimately connected with the projects of elites, as I've remarked before, and with war. And in most countries in the world, it was a pact of blood. It was written in blood. The elites had to send their children to die in wars, as they always did in the United States and in the major European powers. Marx famously underestimated the importance of nationalism, and we should not commit that same mistake. So the debate that we're having has, in the course up to now, has been mainly in a national setting. The nation states are the main scene of action in the world. But there's this other scene of action, which is globalization, the character of the globalization. And the argument that I'm going to make about globalization is parallel to the argument that I made about change in the nation state. So we see now the birth in the world of a new focus of ideological conflict. It's no longer the market against the state, more state, less market, more market, less state, synthesis of market and state, which would be social democracy or social liberalism. It's a debate about the alternative institutional forms of market orders, democratic governments, and independent civil societies. And that's the argument I've tried to develop here. There's a parallel argument to that in the international setting, which is the argument about globalization, in which we say we don't want just to have more or less globalization, we might want to have a different globalization. And indeed, I'm going to argue today, the kinds of alternatives I've been exploring in the course would require an alternative form of globalization. So there's a resonance, a reflection of the national argument in an argument about globalization. Yes.
Does your view then presuppose that that international sphere is marked by nations thinking other nations are going to try to dominate me, are going to try to change me, and I need to adapt internally?
Say that again. Say the last part.
Basically, nations trying to dominate other nations.
Well, as soon as there is the state, with the creation of the state, humanity acquires a tremendous lever for transformation, because the state has the monopoly of violence, the state makes the laws, and the laws then become the source of the definition of the institutions, of the institutional arrangements of society. With this price of the constant potential for war. So as soon as there's a state which lifts a shield over the national difference, there's the danger of war. The states are fearful of one another. The states are driven by fear into violence. They're fearful of one another. And then there's an international anarchy. Now, how should we respond to this international anarchy that arises from the phenomenon of the difference of peoples? That's at the heart of the question you just asked. And one could say there should be a world government. But a world government seems to be the beginning of the suppression of the national difference. A world government would be a world empire. And as soon as there's this world empire, this value of difference begins to disappear, to be threatened. That's the dilemma that's at the heart of your question. So in the West, the main road that has been taken was the road, for example, taken by Grotius in the 17th century, to think of international society as a society of independent states, of sovereign states, that will not evolve into an empire or into a worldwide federation of some kind. And I accept that position, that humanity wants peace. It does not want an empire. It does not want a world government, a single government. But then it seems that the price of not having a single government is the possibility of war. That's the tremendous price that has to be paid. What's the solution to that dilemma is the question. And in principle, the solution would be some form of global governance that does not presuppose a world government. And that problem has no counterpart in the national debate, in the setting of the debate about alternatives within the nation state. It's a unique problem. So in order for the different nations of the world to remain the main setting of action, there cannot be a world government. But if there is not a world government, how can we avoid war among the great powers, which has always been the major global evil confronting humanity? That's the problem that is at the heart of this discussion that we're going to have today. Is there some aspect of this problem that deserves special attention? I may not have emphasized adequately. Now let me say something about globalization, the next set of remarks. In the history of the last 2 centuries, globalization has come twice. It came first in the period from about 1870 to the First World War. Then, between the 2 world wars, there was a breakdown, a violent, dramatic breakdown of the global order. And then, after the Second World War, it began to come a second time, starting in 1946 after the war and picking up speed after 1970. Globalization has been an idea instantiated and enforced by a conception of convergence and by the discipline of capital. And let me now compare those 2 episodes in that respect. So we cannot say simply, in any simple way, straightforward way, that the second episode of globalization has gone further than the first episode. It has in some ways, and it hasn't in other ways. So gross capital flows in the world are much greater now in the second episode of globalization than they were in the first episode of globalization. But net capital flows remain smaller now than they were then. Trade, as a percentage of GDP, trade flows have only recently become larger in the second episode of globalization than they were in the first episode. And migratory flows in the second episode of globalization are much, much smaller than they were in the first episode of globalization. So there's no simple accounting by which you could say that the flows in the second episode of globalization are greater than the flows in the first episode of globalization. However, there is a structural similarity. In both episodes of globalization, there was a powerful idea of convergence. In the first episode of globalization, the focal point of the convergence was Great Britain and the European powers. And the opposition, the resistance to this idea of convergence came from the wounded civilizations of the world. Nurturing their resentments, their desire for difference, the beginning of this phenomenon of the arousal of the desire for difference in the presence of the waning of actual difference. But it wasn't just an idea, it was enforced by the discipline of capital. And in that epoch, before the First World War, the main way in which it was enforced was by the gold standard. If a country failed to abide by the rules of the global system, gold would flow out and there would be a balance of payments crisis. The Marxist economist Kalecki observed that the practical significance of the gold standard was to make the level of economic activity and prosperity depend on the level of business confidence. So it was a kind of automatic trap or mechanism for enforcing the idea of convergence. Now, in the present episode of globalization, the same two elements are present. There's an idea of convergence, but now the idea is much more clearly articulated than it was then. It's codified, it's canonized in particular formulations such as the so-called Washington Consensus or the augmented Washington Consensus. It's actually written out by the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which then may make its loans conditional on the acceptance of this codified version of the idea of convergence. And the resistance to the convergence is also much more powerful. So what's the equivalent to the gold standard now? It's what you could call a functional alternative to the gold standard. And the functional alternative to the gold standard is a syndrome of policies, especially implemented by the Latin American countries in this period of the late 20th century. They were opening of the capital account, an acquiescence in a low level of domestic saving, and consequent dependence on foreign capital, and a view of fiscal discipline that emphasized restraints on spending rather than increases on taxation. So the idea was to transform the dependence of national governments on foreign capital into not a problem but a solution. It was viewed as a solution because it would be a restraint on the autarkic and populist adventurism of the Latin American governments. Now, in the same historical period, the countries of East Asia, the so-called tiger economies, preceded by Japan. First Japan, then the tiger economies, and then ultimately China, responded to the same constraints, to the same pressure toward convergence in a radically different way. So they maintained restraints on the capital account, and they prevented the penetration of foreign capital into the productive system. At the outset of their development, they insisted that there be an emphasis on loan capital rather than on investment in the real economy, because they did not want their real economy to be dominated by foreign owners. Now we know what happened. So the Latin American republics that signed on to the Bible of convergence, of neoliberal orthodoxy, the Washington Consensus and the augmented Washington Consensus, declined dramatically in their participation in world GDP. And the East Asian economies, Japan, the tiger economies in China, exploded in miracles of growth, thus illustrating the principle which I've invoked before in the argument that in history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. The Latin American countries signed on the dotted line, and the result was their immiseration. In the eyes of the world, in the second episode of globalization, globalization has meant Americanization, because globalization, until recently, was identified with acceptance of the order created after the Second World War by the United States. And the statesmen of the United States, from the outset of the history of the Republic, even when the country was not yet a power, a world power, formulated the two principles from which American foreign policy has never since deviated. The two principles are, first, that the United States will exercise in the Western Hemisphere, in its region of the world, an undisputed hegemony, an incontestable hegemony. This pretension was manifest in the Monroe Doctrine first, and then in the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, referring to Teddy Roosevelt. And the second principle is that the United States will prevent any power from consolidating in its region of the world a regional hegemony so incontestable that on the basis of that regional hegemony, it can then bid for world hegemony. These are the two principles on which American foreign policy has been founded, and the American statesmen, as I say, never deviated from it, even long before the United States became a world power, when it was still a weak republic at the margins of the global system. Now let me come to the description of the present form of globalization in a particular area, which is trade. So we can distinguish the security arrangements of the world, the antidotes to war, that's the most important, the monetary arrangements, which now the dollar remains the reserve currency of the world, and the commercial, the trade arrangements. And what I'm going to do now is to contrast the form of globalization that is being organized in the world, that has been organized, in this second episode of globalization, to an alternative that would be more hospitable to the kinds of national alternatives that I've been discussing in the course. So the first principle of the established form of globalization is the idea that the goal is to maximize free trade. The more free trade, the better. And one could say free trade cannot be the goal, not at least if alternatives like the ones that I've been exploring in the course are to be advanced. The goal should be the coexistence of alternative development strategies and institutional pathways for development and alternative experiments in civilization within a world economy that becomes gradually and progressively more open. That's the goal. Free trade cannot be itself the goal. Free trade is a means and not an end. Free trade in things and in money, the free circulation in the world of money, of capital, and of goods and services is sometimes good and sometimes bad, and the circulation of people is sacrosanct. The goal should be this reconciliation of alternative experiments in humanity, alternative development strategies within a world economy that gradually becomes more open. Now we come to the second principle. The present form of globalization manifests in the WTO treaties, and now more significantly in the regional trade pacts, the multilateral trade pacts like the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact, the Transatlantic Trade Pacts. The goal is to the idea is to require that the trading countries, as a condition of their participation in the world trading system, adhere not just to a market economy, the abstract idea of a market economy, but to a particular version of the market economy. So, for example, it should be a version that under the label subsidies outlaws under all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich use to become rich, but they want to deny to the latecomers. It should be to require that they all sign on to the odious regime of intellectual property rights that was developed at the end of the 19th century, the patent regime, for example, and that has the practical consequence of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest value to humanity, like the pharmaceutical innovations, in the control of a handful of multinational businesses. So we could describe this as an institutional and legal maximalism. Not just adherence to the market economy, but adherence to a particular version of the market economy. Now, all of the alternatives we've been discussing presuppose experiments with the legal and institutional form of the market order. So they are incompatible with this institutional maximalism. What then should be the presupposition? It should be an institutional minimalism. The maximum of freedom to experiment with the legal and institutional form of a market order. We know that that's possible because an institutional minimalism was the characteristic of the regime that anteceded the WTO regime, the regime of the GATT, of the General Agreement on Trade, Tariffs and Trade. The greatest freedom to experiment, compatible with a market order. Now, we don't have to look just to what came before the WTO treaties. We can look to the history of commercial law, of the law merchant. For centuries in Western Europe, the evolution of the law merchant was predicated on the reconciliation of a diversity of laws with the possibility of having a basic framework for the international law merchant that would allow commerce among different countries. So, for example, when the Hanseatic cities, the members of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic, traded with the Russian Empire, this was trade with a country that had radically different laws, and the jurists developed a law of international transactions that could be reconciled with the diversity of the underlying legal jurisdictions. And that was another example, a historical example of institutional minimalism, of legal and institutional minimalism. It was the legal basis for commerce among these countries with radically different laws. Now let me take a little detour and make an observation about one of the fundamental defects of the dominant economic theory, the theory that the marginalist economists developed at the end of the 19th century. The dominant economic theory is a theory of competitive selection. And in this sense, it's similar to Darwinism, which is also a theory of competitive selection. But there's a difference. In the economic theory, there is an idea about competitive selection, but there is no theory of the genesis of the different material from which competitive selection selects. So in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, there are two theories. There's a theory of competitive selection, which is the Darwinian theory of evolution, and there's a theory of genetic mutation and recombination, generating the diverse stuff from which the competitive selection selects. In this theory, it's only half of the theory. It's only half of what the neo-Darwinian synthesis offers. The other half is missing. And what a biologist would say is that we can't evaluate the efficacy or the reality of the method of competitive selection unless we also have an idea about the genesis of the material from which the mechanism of competitive selection selects. So the institutional minimalism is not just necessary, it is a necessary precondition for the creation of this diverse stuff. From the standpoint of the economics of today, the world might just as well be a single country. The division of the world into peoples is an accident or an embarrassment with no proper economic significance. But it does have an economic significance. Its significance is to be one of the bases for this diversity of the stuff from which the competitive selection selects. Now, the third architectural characteristic of the present form of trade globalization is the radical difference in its treatment of the mobility of things and of capital and its treatment of the mobility of people. The principle is that goods and services and money should be as free as possible to roam the world and to cross national frontiers. But people should be arrested within the nation state or within blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states, such as the European Union. And of course, this has no basis whatsoever in economic or political theory. There's no reason for this imprisonment of labor within the nation state. Theoretically, no economic reason, no economic justification. We know, obviously, that the free mobility of labor in the world would be revolutionary and that would immediately result in massive upheaval in every country in the world. It couldn't be established overnight, but no one is proposing that. In fact, it is the greatest possible influence on the diminishment of inequality among countries in the returns to labor. So it couldn't be established suddenly. It would have to be established gradually and with safeguards, compensations for the countries that send people because they've invested in the formation of human capital. They prepare scientists, and the scientists leave and go somewhere else. They have to be compensated for their investment in the formation of those people. And safeguards on the part of the receiving countries, which can't be expected to entitle the incoming workers immediately. There have to be phases: temporary work permits, long-time residence, and only at the end of a long process, citizenship. But the general alternative to this radical diversity of treatment would be to say, we won't have a system under which things and money acquire radical freedom all at once and people are imprisoned in the nation state. Things, money, and people will acquire freedom together in small cumulative steps, and that would be the alternative. Now, finally, we could say there's the fourth principle. The world economy is being organized supposedly under a principle of free labor. But there's no requirement that labor be free, actually, in any particular way. So obviously, the countries of the world at different stages of development have to be free to compete on the basis of the returns to labor. Some countries have abundant labor, paid very low, with cheap wage. Other countries have less labor with a higher wage. And we can't abolish that. But what we could say is that there has to be freedom in the defense of the rights of labor. And the freedom is not just freedom to unionize for wage labor. It has to be freedom to experiment with an economic order in which the higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation, come to prevail over wage labor. So radical freedom in order to make real the principle that the world economy will be based on free labor. So there's a simple contrast of two directions of commercial globalization. One is the one that's underway. It's the one that's being built in the world. And it's based on the maximization of free trade, taking free trade as the end. It's based on institutional maximalism, adherence not just to the abstract idea of a market economy, but to a particular version of the market economy, excluding subsidies, incorporating the regime of intellectual property, and so forth. It is a form of globalization that wants to accentuate the difference between the treatment of the mobility of things and of capital and the treatment of the mobility of labor. And it wants not to affirm the dependence on free labor in a way which would permit and encourage the experiments in the direction for the promotion of the higher forms of free labor. Now, how could such an alternative come about in the world? How could this alternative form of commercial globalization come to prevail over the existing form? So radically different. The only way in which it could come about is through innovation down below in the primary scene of political and economic action, which is the nation state. There would have to be movement in the nation states in an alternative direction, movement that conflicts with the restraints imposed by this form of globalization. Then there would be an alteration of the form of globalization, second stage. And then the third stage would be, with that alteration in the form of globalization, then the national experiments are pushed forward, further. So in other words, the driver of the movement, the initial driver of the movement is down below in the nation state. It's just like the argument I made about the European Union. And the European Union is, after all, offered as a model of globalization in the world. So in the European Union today, the power to define the forms of economic and social organization is increasingly centralized in Brussels and Berlin. And the social and educational endowments of the citizens are then devolved to the national and subnational authorities. And I argued then, when we discussed the European Union, that it should be exactly the opposite. The primary responsibility of the Union should be to define and develop the endowments, the capabilities of all of its citizens, but to give the member states the greatest latitude for experiment and diversity. And this argument that I just made about globalization is just like that argument about the European Union. Now let me stop there for a moment and ask whether someone would like to make a comment about this contrast of two forms of commercial globalization. Do you see what's involved? What's implied in this contrast? There's no necessary form of globalization. So if you compare the globalization prefigured by this alternative to the existing globalization, you can't really say that it's more or less globalization. It's a different kind of globalization. And that's the point. Just as the arguments we had before were not more market or less market, but a different kind of market order. So let's, for example, free trade, which is now a theme of debate in the United States and the world. Free trade is never an absolute. It's never an end in itself. When is it most likely to be more useful? It's most likely to be more useful among economies that are either comparable in their level of development or else radically different. So the premise of conventional trade theory was trade between rich economies abundant in capital and poor economies abundant in labor. And when is protectionism more likely to be useful? It's more likely to be useful when the trading countries are within striking range of one another. They're unequal, but not radically unequal. And the catch-up economy is within striking range of the more advanced economy. That's the context in which some form of active or selective protectionism can be justified. Now, I want to complement this discussion of globalization and the alternative forms of globalization with a debate I've been having with my friend and colleague, Danny Roderick. Roderick has asserted that there is a trilemma of globalization. And he says, take three attributes, what he calls hyperglobalization, proceeding in the direction of convergence among countries in the world. Mass politics, especially democratic mass politics, and national sovereignty. And he says, all three of these cannot be compatible. You have to pick two of the three. That's the trilemma. And it has implications then for what prevails. If you want hyperglobalization and national sovereignty, especially national sovereignty in monetary and fiscal policy, you have to have some version of the golden straitjacket. The gold standard, or what I call the functional surrogate for the gold standard, as in the policies of the Latin American countries. If you want hyperglobalization and mass politics, you have to have some form of world federalism, beginning of world government, which I earlier denounced today. And if you want national sovereignty and mass politics, it's the Bretton Woods Compromise, the compromise established through the IMF and similar organizations after the Second World War. Now, I want to argue this trilemma is false, and its falsehood is very revealing. The simple way of saying why it's false is that it can't be true because these three things coexist now. So hyperglobalization cannot mean that the rules of the different economies of the world become the same, that they converge to the same order. They can't mean that. Because hyperglobalization is a description of a tendency to convergence, but not the description of an imaginary outcome of total convergence that they all become alike, all the same. National sovereignty cannot mean the adoption of strong national projects. What do I mean by strong national projects? Massive mobilization of resources for the sake of development. Distinct institutional pathways. And the translation of these distinct international pathways into the economic shield for national rebellion, such as, for example, having a high level of domestic saving, to be able to resist the imposition of foreign capital to take one path rather than another. Mass politics today must mean either the weak democracies that exist in the world or the authoritarian regimes. Not the high energy democracy that I discussed. So the tendency to convergence manifests, for example, in the dominant form of globalization. National sovereignty without strong national projects and mass politics without high energy democracy is what we have. And all three elements coexist. How would this change? It would change if instead of this hyper-globalization, we have the idea of globalization based on institutional minimalism, as in the example I just gave in the commercial context. National sovereignty with strong national projects, and mass politics in the form of high energy democracy. So strong national projects, massive mobilization of resources, institutional divergence, institutional rebellion, and the economic shield of rebellion in high foreign reserves and high levels of domestic saving. Mass politics in the form of high energy democracy, meaning a democracy that creates trouble for the class system, that weakens path dependency, the influence of the past on the future, and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, and weakens the dependence of change on crisis. Remember, high mobilization, rapid resolution of impasse, combination of strong central action with a facility for divergence by parts of the country. If we had high energy democracy and national sovereignty with strong national projects in many countries of the world, the dominant form of globalization would be overthrown. And the globalization based on institutional maximalism would be overthrown, would be replaced by globalization based on institutional minimalism. So either we have the present reality in which, with the kind of democracies that exist and the kind of national sovereignty that exists, all three elements coexist. We don't have to choose two of the three, we have all three. And in the alternative world in which there were a different democracy and a different kind of national sovereignty based on these strong national projects, there would be a different kind of globalization and they would also coexist. So either in the existing world or in the alternative world, the trilemma is false. That was my argument with Roderick. Would someone like to comment on this argument? So of course, the commercial setting is not the main setting of the exploration of the global order. The fundamental problem is the problem of war. And then the question is, what's the most promising path for the organization of a world in which we can have global governance without a world government? A world government is the beginning of the suppression of the differences in humanity. And these differences are vital for all of the alternatives that we've been exploring so far. So let's first understand what has not worked. What has not worked is the system that was developed by the United States and its allies after the Second World War. The United Nations system. The United Nations system is a failure. Its two main institutions, the General Assembly and the Security Council, are both failures. The General Assembly is a debating club, is a talking shop that combines dozens of minuscule pseudo-states with real states, with real countries. And the Security Council is almost inevitably paralyzed by the veto power exercised by the putative victors of a war that ended 80 years ago. So, for example, when the United States and its allies want to prosecute a campaign, they fill up the balloon, they fill up the air of this balloon of the Security Council and try and attain redress from it. And if they don't obtain redress from it, they go outside of it and organize a coalition outside of the Security Council. So the Security Council has no role. Where the United Nations has worked is as an umbrella organization for meetings like the so-called Conference of the Parties, the climate meetings. Like the Paris meeting or the Glasgow meeting. So what is the way forward? The way forward is the development, especially by the second level powers, of coalitions among the states of the world. The densification of their associational structure by the organization of coalitions. And there are three kinds of coalitions. There are single-purpose coalitions in which states cooperate to solve a problem. Like, for example, human trafficking. But an example of a problem relevant to what we've been discussing is the redefinition of the advanced technologies of the knowledge economy in a form that would make them accessible to small and medium-sized businesses in the developing countries of the world. And indeed also in the advanced countries, including the United States. Second, regional coalitions. The European Union, the African Union. And third, similar state coalitions of states that occupy an equivalent function in the international system. And the most important examples today are the G7 and the BRICS. And what can we do to avert war in the world? It's to increase the level of this density of cooperation through these arrangements designed to provide global public goods or to avert global public evils. The two great powers in the world today are in radically different situations. China is a unique example in modern history, or indeed in all world history, of a great power that is almost completely isolated. It has no friends and allies. Its allies are Korea, North Korea, a friendless friend, Pakistan, which would rather not be an ally of China, and is an ally just circumstantially because of its antagonism with India, and Cambodia, a hapless client state. It has no allies. And this, rather than being a reason for happiness of its enemies, should be a reason for fear. Because the experience of encirclement and isolation in world history has always been one of the main provocations to war. And then there's the United States, which is not in imaginative communion with the rest of humanity, and claims the position of primus inter pares, and is now taking the lead in the subversion of the world order that it itself built after the Second World War. So what should the world do with these two solipsistic Gullivers, the United States and China? I think it should do what the Lilliputians did with the original Gulliver. It should tie them down with strings. And the strings are these forms of cooperation that will be seen less as restraints than as helps to involve them in more and more engagements. In such a way and to such an extent that the vinegar of their reciprocal belligerence is more likely to turn back into the wine of peaceful competition. The alternative to that densification of the level of cooperation in the world is war or empire. Either the world becomes an empire under the control of a single power, or it develops this ability to cooperate. So I'm advocating the contemporary equivalent to Grotius, cooperation on the basis of the sovereign states as the alternative to world empire or to war among the nation states. And this is all in the desperate attempt to try and identify the international equivalent, the international counterpart to the national discussion that we've been having up to now in the course. Now, I really don't want to say anything more about this. So I'm counting on you to make remarks now, to carry forward the argument.
Well, there is an absence here.
Talk. Microphone.
Okay, there is an absence here in your argumentation. It's about the financial system.
The financial system.
Yes, how can sovereign nations do experiments if they are not, they have no sovereignty over some financial system?
Over?
If they have no sovereignty over its own financial system, how can we solve the problem of the global governance exercised by the international financial system that has no governance, that has no any mutual.
So there are two aspects to that problem, I think. So one aspect is related to the discussion that we were having earlier today about the gold standard and the functional equivalent to it. So let me give a little bit of the intellectual background. So in general, in the world, when the Marxists lost faith in Marxism, they became Keynesians. So a kind of cheap, vulgar Keynesianism is the intellectual successor to Marxist economics. One of Keynes's propositions is that saving is more the consequence of growth than the cause of growth. So you don't have to worry about the level of saving in the country. You have to worry about growth. And you can spend your way into growth in one form or another. And that hasn't worked. It doesn't work because Keynes did not appreciate the strategic significance of having a high level of reserves and of saving early in the process of development, as a buffer, as a shield. So even though theoretically it's true that saving is more the consequence than the cause of growth, in the short term, a country that wants to rebel and wants to develop a rebellious strategy of economic growth, as China did, has to have a shield. It has to have a buffer. So it has to impose great sacrifices, including in generating high reserves of hard currency and a high level of domestic saving, both public and private, in order to be able to resist and begin the initial steps of a rebellious strategy of national development. That's what allowed the East Asian economies to take a different path than the path that the Latin American economies took. And they were rewarded. Because in the medium term, the only thing that interests capital is reality, not religion. In the short term, there's the religion of capital. Do you pay homage to our principles of fiscal austerity, of impoverishing the government and so forth? But in the medium term, the only thing that counts is opportunities for profit. So what is the country that today and for a long time has received the highest level of foreign investment? China, which has violated all the principles of the financiers, and it illustrates that for capital, a genuflection to the religion of capital counts only in the very short term. In the medium term, it counts for nothing. The only thing that counts for reality is reality, the opportunity for profit. So it's necessary for these developing countries to create the fiscal shield of developmentalist rebellion in the initial stages of their development projects. And that's what gives them financial independence. Now, then there's the second aspect of your question, which is how then can they organize in the world a form of financial independence? And of course, they can't so long as the dollar remains the reserve currency of the world. So the substitution of the dollar is imperative, because otherwise the whole world depends for economic growth on the conveniences of trade and of monetary policy in the United States. If the Fed wants to increase the interest rate because there's inflation in the United States, then the whole world has to suffer. So that's not acceptable, obviously. And the dethronement of the dollar is already in its early stages. The initial steps are to allow the major countries of the world to trade directly among themselves in a currency that avoids the dollar until they're able to create an international currency or equivalent currency, which is what Keynes imagined the drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund to be, which then makes the economic activity in the world independent from monetary policy in the major power. And that's the second step. And that's the practical answer to your question. But I think that the beginning of everything is rebellion in the nation state. That is, there have to be a number of nation states who find that their development project, their opportunity to create growth miracles, is incompatible with the constraints of the present form of globalization. Yes.
I'd like just to build up on this discussion of the reliance on the dollar for the currency. So the BRICS are currently trying to do something along these lines, but they're facing a big return.
Say that again?
The BRICS.
The BRICS.
Yeah. They're trying to do it, something similar to that, it's like a common
You mean with
currency for
respect
trade.
to the replacement of the dollar?
Yes.
They're already doing it, yes.
Yeah, but
So
they're facing
15 years ago, when this theme was first raised with the Chinese, they were horrified because China has its reserves in dollars, and they didn't want any commotion that would threaten the value of the reserves in the world currency market. Now they've changed their position completely, and now they're advocates of the very thing which they denounced then. And this change happened in a very short period of time. So this shows that many of these things I've been discussing, which may seem unacceptable, are in fact capable of being accepted within a very short time horizon.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to ask you, what do you think would be the transition? Because as things stand, the Trump administration, for example, said that if this currency really goes on being adopted, they're gonna put on.
No,
like-
you lost me. You have to go slower. Talk louder. Just
Okay,
talk
can-
louder.
is it
Shout
better?
like I do.
Okay, so my question is regarding the transition in between the current system and a potentially a new one in which, for example, this BRIC currency is applicable, because the current U.S. administration has promised to put like very hard retaliation if this initiative is actually implemented. So they thought about 50% tariffs, for example. So what do you think this transition might look like?
What do you mean, the transition in the monetary arrangements?
Yeah, like
Well, I think it's the same problem that we're discussing. Arm yourself. I mean, not with weapons. Arm yourself with money. Have a high level of domestic saving. If you have a sufficiently high level of domestic saving, you can send everyone to hell. You can say, get lost. You have to create a buffer to be able to have this freedom of maneuver. And once you have the freedom of maneuver, you're able to mount your strategy. But independence is costly. There's no alternative to that. Either you sacrifice. So there are really only two ways. There's the way that the Latin Americans took, which is to be obedient, right? So there's the financier, the big bankers, let's call them the man on the shore, who's the intermediary between foreign capital and national capital. So you have the man on the shore profiting from being the intermediary between foreign capital and local capital. And the man on the shore wants everyone to show good behavior. Good behavior means opening the capital account, allowing the penetration of the national economy by foreign capital, and doing everything which orthodoxy recommends. So either you do that, or you have the person plotting national rebellion who says, we will arm ourselves so that we can have a distinct developmental policy. And that's a different logic. So it's either one or the other. There's no middle way. I think that any kind of threat loses its power when the country has armed itself with the economic shield of national rebellion. And the economic shield can mean high reserves and high levels of saving. So it's another example of the slogan of a war economy without a war. Massive mobilization, financial, technical, and human resources. Definition of institutional strategies for equipping, empowering national production. The shield of national rebellion. That's the beginning. So the discussion today was about what kind of globalization would recognize, would be most hospitable to alternatives like the alternatives we've been discussing. But I have to insist on a simple point. The East Asian economies and the Chinese economy were able to do this even within the present form of globalization. So that demonstrates that the present form of globalization does not require a unique response. The constraints that exist today existed 30 years ago, and the Chinese nevertheless did what they did. So it's just not true that the present form of globalization requires this narrow response. of the Latin Americans. Latin Americans obeyed, and they paid for their obedience by becoming much poorer than they were before. And that's the result. And it's only not more dramatic because South America is so rich in natural resources that it was able to camouflage, to conceal its immiseration because of the wealth generated by agriculture, ranching, and mining. Otherwise, it would be much worse. And the contrast between China and Latin America would be even more dramatic than it now is. Yes.
I just wanted, since this class started out with a discussion about the role that the erosion of customary collective identities.
The role that?
The role of the erosion of customary collective identities. The moral
The
specialization.
erosion of
Yeah, the erosion of what you refer to as customary collective identities.
customary identities, yes.
One can say this is about
Yes.
cultural globalization of some sort.
Yes.
I wanted to remark that at least one vision of globalization in the context of international human rights law or humanitarian law even views the ideas of these customary identities as something that's inimical to individual dignity in certain situations. The idea that we can develop individual freedom of sorts through a top-down order, that idea seems to be at odds with
Now, what do you mean by a top-down model?
international law
Uh-huh.
for human rights, for example.
Yeah.
Whatever its failures have been, the alternative of specific nation states defending the dignity of the individuals living within them also seems to be flawed. The idea that those can change through external pressure instead of internal evolution is an alternative way of looking at this problem of how to create freedom at the individual level. Essentially, the idea of nation states not as a buffer or a shield for individuals to experiment, but as the enemy of experimentation, where the group is the problem.
And so what's the question then? What's your observation?
That would refer to a model of globalization that is not aimed at experimentation, but at the consolidation of rules related to human rights.
I'm afraid I don't understand. You're going to have to explain it again.
The sense I got was that you referred early on in the class to this erosion of group identities, nation
Yes,
identities.
so the
as
context of the argument was this idea that when it meant to be a part of a nation was you had a certain set of customs. You followed the customs of the ancient Romans. Those tangible identities, I claimed, are being hollowed out. And then the will to difference is aroused, even as actual difference wanes. Now, what's then the comment?
I sense that you positioned this as a problem because it provokes war. This will to difference, this will to hold on to the remnants of one's identity, to differentiate. You're positioning this as a cause for worry. And so I sensed that you were referring to a model of globalization that permits for greater experimentation internally and therefore greater differences in national identities. But what I'm suggesting is that there are certain aspects of national identities, including the customary character of a nation, which we can consider problematic for individual freedom. For example, the customary character of a nation might be such as to be highly communitarian, highly oppressive of individual freedom. Those sorts of differences in collective identities can be problematic for the projects related to individual freedom
Yes.
instead. This is an old story about how human rights might need to be a form of international law. And it can't be expected that fundamental rights and those freedoms will develop experimentally within nations, given the nature of nations.
I think that, so let me respond to you by giving you an example from of the problem in my own country. So we have in Brazil, in the Amazon, the Indian tribes. And we actually have, compared to the Andean countries, we have a very small population of Indians. In the tens of thousands, not in the millions. And we reserve vast amounts of land for them, but we prohibit practically any economic activity from occurring in these Indian reservations. So the greatest calamity that befell the Indian tribes in Brazil was the substitution of the Jesuits, who were the defenders, by the anthropologists. Because this was the greatest disaster, because the anthropologists had the idea that the protagonists in world history are these collective identities. They're like fossils in a museum, right? And you can't touch them. So here's a realistic problem we have. We have to provide the Indian peoples with access to economic and educational opportunities. But we have to do it in a way in which the way of providing the opportunity not predetermine the outcome. So a few of the Indian tribes are completely isolated. And in providing them with access to economic and educational opportunities, we can't predetermine that they will be assimilated if their collective choice is not to be assimilated. But now comes the problem. The individual Indian, a young Indian, who wants to rebel against his tribe, is a citizen of the Republic. And the Republic has to stand by his side and allow him to do that. The anthropologists are horrified by this idea, but we have to be there, guaranteeing him the right to rebel. So it's not just the collective assertion, but it's the ability for this dialectic. So this is a struggle of ideas of who we are. We're not these collective species. I want the Indians to be able to smash their traditional culture, just as I want to be able to smash mine. It's not a claim of the primacy of Western culture over their culture. It's a claim that all cultures are dust in the face of God. And as opposed to the anthropologists. So the anthropologists say, there's a theology of immanence, and there's the pragmatics of sufficiency. So according to the traditional Indian culture as imagined by the anthropologists, you work up to a certain point, then you stop working. That's what they describe as the pragmatics of sufficiency. And the theology of immanence is the existing forms and habits are sacred. They have to be respected. Well, I don't want them to be respected. I want fire throughout the world. I want the whole world to burn. It's it's the opposite of the religion of the anthropologists. And there's no way of circumventing that struggle of ideas. Because I think that once we have the experience, no one who has experienced the fire of rebellion will ever go back to the other thing. It's irreversible. Whereas their religion is not irreversible. The religion of the theology of immanence and the pragmatics of sufficiency. So I think that the most powerful ideal in the world is the ideal of agency now. The enhancement of agency. The power of the ordinary man and woman to turn the tables against his context and to rebel, to create. And I think that individual agency does depend on collective agency. That this enhancement of the power of personal agency can only occur in the context of societies that are able to create differences. If the individual is unhappy with his society, he was born in the wrong place, he should be able to flee and seek refuge in another society. So this possibility of escape is also one of the preconditions. But the reverse is not true. That is, collective agency does not substitute for individual agency. Individual agency requires collective agency, but collective agency doesn't replace individual agency. That's the real situation. And we have to form an idea about that and to fight for it. And I'm not embarrassed to do that. And I don't think this is individualism against communitarianism. I think this is a view that respects the transcendence of the human being over a view that doesn't. It's not about the individual and the collective. A central attribute of who we are is that everything in our experience as human beings points beyond itself. So we're finite, but we're transcendent. And I want this transcendence to be respected in both its collective and its individual expression. And all this stuff about states and wars and profits, and this is all part of the consequence of this. And so the world that I want is a world in which this dialectic of individual and collective agency can advance and can affirm itself. Well, heavy stuff, so we'll go on. Okay. Thank you. Leon. Hello.
I have two questions. One's kind of practical, and then one that's more, I guess, related to the start with the latter. You wrote in the Motivation speech, Free Trade Reimagined, I think.
Yes.
That's basically under the program that you suggested.
The program for globalization.
Yeah, allowing for sort of more types of market economies that we would be able to or governments and firms cooperating would be able to essentially construct their own comparative advantage.
Well, that's what they do. That's not a proposal. That's the nature of comparative advantage. All the comparative advantages that exist in the world
Right.
didn't just spontaneously appear.
Which I think is a very interesting idea, I guess, or something that jumped out at me because in all the econ classes I've taken,
Comparative advantage is treated as if it were a natural fact.
exactly.
Just there. It's not just there. That is, so Ricardo's example in the original doctrine of comparative advantage was the change between England, port, Portuguese port, and English manufacturing. So how did they arrive? Because the English invented the steam engine and then they created this industry. It wasn't just in the rolling hills of England, naturally there forever, right?
Yeah.
So every comparative advantage is a creation.
And so this globalization or type of globalization would essentially
It's hospitable to the invention of more comparative advantage. It's a way of accelerating this pseudo-natural process.
that seems like it seems like a simple idea, but it does kind of have like a light bulb.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. I guess the more logistical questions. I'm thinking about how I'm writing my paper, and I'm an undergraduate, just for context. I guess I'm wondering what you're kind of looking for in the construction of the paper. It's
I'm looking for just a strong voice struggling to form itself. I mean, that's it. It's an invitation to use the response to the argument of the course as a pretext, as a trigger for the development of your own voice,
okay.
with respect to content and with respect to form.
I guess, I'm not sure, he said he wanted to schedule office hours with you next week. I think next week, if we were to walk, I don't know, is this like a,
Sure, just go over. If you want to come over with me, you can come over.
I'd love to discuss this further, because I have some ideas as to like how I'm gonna poke and prod at
Yeah, I don't want to be in a position of vetting papers and paper topics.
No, I
And
just
I'm happy to talk about it.
think it's good to talk about, yeah, in general,
Sure.
so. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
So the women, there's a straight jacket. What's written there? Straight jacket.
Straight jacket. Camisa de força.
Só, eu tô com o. Qual é o nome daqui? Portfólio do estudo de pesquisa. A gente vai ter que decidir duas alternativas aí baratas, mas as duas não têm tradição no mercado. Então,
Qual é o
vamos decidir o
preço?
que a gente vai fazer.
Do Instituto de Pesquisa.